nearing the end of the 15th chapter. Today we start with the 33rd verse, and you could easily read through this and perhaps not know that you had gotten to it, but this really is in many ways the pinnacle of the Gospel of Mark. Mark has been leading us to a place, and that place is very significant. It's somewhat subtle. Mark doesn't necessarily put a neon sign or an arrow pointing to it, but when you understand why it's there and its purpose, I think this is, in many ways, this is the mountaintop of the gospel, and so of Mark's gospel. And so we'll jump in today. Remember that we left Jesus, the story yesterday, with Jesus on the cross, and we continue that today. Verse 33, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a stick and gave him some to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down. Let's stop there, Michael. I think maybe people who have spent time in church would know, but this cry in Mark, this is the only thing that Jesus says. There are 7 last words from the cross scattered throughout the Gospels. Mark contributes only this one. And what I think maybe can be missed by a casual reader is that Jesus is quoting a psalm here. This is the first opening words of Psalm 22. And as a devout Jew, Jesus would have certainly known the rest of the psalm, as would of most of his hearers. And it's important that while that psalm starts with forsakenness and hardship, it really ends on a positive note of praise and of hope. And it's not to say that Jesus isn't really expressing the sentiments of the first verse. I think that he is, but it also is kind of a ... in that it goes somewhere, and the listeners, and certainly Jesus as the one who speaks it, would know where it goes.
Right, and not only that, but the text itself says that he's calling Elijah, which once again harkens back to this idea that Jesus is drawing from that storied Old Testament literature that you're referencing, Clint. I think there's a lot of allusion here that we might just miss if we were to read over it. And once again, this idea that Elijah is going to come and take him down. And if you remember back earlier in the gospel, this isn't the first time we've seen Elijah. We've seen Elijah a few times now, people saying that Jesus was Elijah. And then we had another time, particularly because of Jesus' teaching. And then we have the transfiguration moment. I think what's interesting in this is it's clear that those in the crowd have completely given up on Jesus. In other words, any claim to being Messiah, Son of God, who is this person? That's all been laid aside at this point. Now he's a criminal who's dying on the cross, and he's being laid bare so that everyone can see that he was a fraud the whole time. I think that's this mentality that Mark is presenting here of the crowd. They've given up on Jesus, which is interesting because, as we spoke about yesterday, Jesus is literally in the act of doing the thing he said he was going to do on their behalf.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to tell the story, because clearly those who are watching, this reference to Elijah, these are Jewish people. No Gentile is standing there thinking that Jesus is calling Elijah. This is a messianic kind of thing, that this one who's claimed to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews, this mythology traditionally held that Elijah would come to herald the coming of the Messiah. And so those who say he's calling Elijah are speaking out of a familiarity with the traditions of the day. Ironically, though, they miss the fact, they hear these words, and maybe in his anguish Jesus isn't enunciating clearly, but they don't hear the psalm, which is a messianic psalm. They mistake the words Eloi Eloi for Elijah, and they miss it. So again, we have this very subtle and hugely important in the context of this passage, a subtle moment in which Jesus' own people still don't get it. They're still missing. They still are unable to see the bigger picture, and that becomes hugely significant in a moment. Anything else, Michael?
No, yeah, I think let's move on to that moment.
Okay, so then we move to verse 37. Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. And now the centurion who stood facing him, when he saw that he died in this way, when he breathed his last in this way, said, "Truly this man was God's son." This curtain reference, there's some debate over this, but generally speaking, the common thought is that there is a curtain that separates the main part of the temple from the smallest and most sacred spot in the temple, called the Holy of Holies. And it was a place that only the high priest could go, and really even then he could only go one time per year. And so the general consensus is that separation, that barrier, was torn. And of course the imagery from top to bottom is that God is tearing it. And if that's the curtain that Mark wants us to picture, then we understand that barrier that stands between people and the full holiness and sacredness of God has been opened. That doorway is now torn open, and the barrier that kept people from God's holiness has now been removed. And traditionally, that's what we think we see in that detail.
Right. Only to flesh that out a little bit, I think that what you see before Jesus is that the chief priests and the scribes and the temple rulers exist for the purpose of protecting and preserving that very disjunction. The idea that the high priest is the only one who can enter into the holiest of holy places represents this idea that there's a barrier between God and the people, a barrier that can only be provisionally handled by humans. And when Jesus confronts the religious leadership, as he does so strongly at the end of Mark in particular, we begin to see that the reason for his attack is because now those people, now that the Son of God has come, now that God is literally proclaiming the kingdom has come to bear, now these individuals stand in between him and the people. And so when this curtain is symbolically torn, it's supposed to clue into our minds that now the thing that Jesus represented the whole time has physically happened. And in Jesus's death, he has conquered the very division that he's been critiquing the chief priests, the Sadducees, these leaders of putting in between people and God. He's now finally and eternally ripped that into shreds. And I think that that's a significant both metaphor, but it's also, it clues us in so few of words to the thing that Mark's trying to present here, that when Jesus proclaimed at the beginning of the gospel, the kingdom of God is at hand, we literally now see the marks of that kingdom having arrived.
Yeah, and the idea that God is not captive in the temple, nor are people separated from him. I've always thought the relief in our sanctuary behind the cross picks up some of this language. I think it's also maybe some architecture from other stories. But as I look at it in our sanctuary, those of you who have been there, it always, to me, evokes this imagery, this idea that God has torn the barrier. As we move to verse 39, I think we encounter the signature verse of the gospel. And it again, we can miss it because we don't understand probably the deep and profound division between the Jews and the Gentiles, the Jews and the Romans. We're told that this centurion who watched Jesus breathe his last makes this comment, truly this man was God's son. And if you'll remember, throughout the entire book, we have seen these verses over and over again in which Jesus says, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, keep my secret, keep my secret, keep my secret. And it didn't work, but Mark has reinforced that idea multiple times, the idea that it wasn't time for word to get out yet. And now we see, just as the temple is now opened, the truth is now open as well. This man, who is a Roman soldier, which if you're making a list of the people least likely to understand anything God is doing, this guy would be at the top of the list. And he now looks upon Jesus and says, truly this man was God's son. And at that point, the secret is out. Now, there's also a contrast here with what the Jewish people have not seen. Now even the Gentiles are seeing. And again, remember that Mark may be written to Gentiles, which highlights that reality even more. Michael, I don't know. I don't know how to strongly enough make the case that this is a huge moment in Mark. It's unfortunate that for we as 21st century American readers, it probably just doesn't have the shock factor that it would have landed with on the first readers.
Yeah, for so many reasons. First of all, it's the character. Nobody ever puts the Roman centurion in a positive role in a religious text that is, coming out of a Jewish community. This does not happen. These are not the heroes of stories. It would be unthinkable that you would write this in this way. And then on top of that, Clint, it's dangerous in the work of interpretation to reflect on what wasn't written, but I think it's illustrative in this case. We have really no reference to Roman soldiers at all, except at the end of this gospel. And the gospel writer Mark could have told this story from a ton of different perspectives. You could have framed it from Peter's perspective, or a family member's perspective, or a follower's perspective. He could have easily wrapped up or brought in another character from the story to provide some sort of literary connection in this moment. It is unbelievably important. We should not miss. It is a random person we've never seen before who sees in this moment exactly who Jesus Christ is. The lesson is relatively simple in that. You don't need to be anything in particular to be able to see the truth of who Jesus Christ is. If you're willing to but stand at the foot of the cross and look up, it will be evident to you that this is surely the Son of God. You don't need to be Jewish. You don't need to be a scholar in the law. You don't need to in any way have walked with Jesus or his crew. You didn't need to hear a single sermon that he preached. You can stand at the foot of the cross and you can know the truth of what's happening in that moment. And this centurion represents that. And I think it's an unbelievable sort of turn in the story. Like we said yesterday, when you look back on the entire book that came before it, we now have to reckon with the fact that the people who literally lived and walked with Jesus missed him over and over and over. But yet at the foot of the cross, the revelation of Jesus Christ is so clear that it is unmistakable, even to the Roman centurion, who Jesus is.
Yeah, and the language matters here. It's interesting, not being a Jew, he doesn't use the term Messiah. He doesn't use the term anointed one. He doesn't use the term son of David, anything like that. He says son of God, and not a God, which would have been, well known to Romans, who are very much pantheistic, polytheistic. But he says this man was God's son. And that is hugely significant. Also, I think we want to make sure that we're explicit that it is in Jesus' sacrificial act of death that the secret is out. This is what makes it apparent. to look on the way Jesus died. He says it here. When he saw that he had died in this way, or that in this way he breathed his last, he makes this comment. So it is Jesus' sacrificial giving of himself that makes it apparent who he is and what he has then done. And we don't want to overdo this verse, but if you're looking for the destination that Mark has kind of been taking us, really this is it. Arguably more, we'll come back to it, but arguably this matters more to Mark than the Easter story. We'll talk about that probably next week at some point.
Yeah, so I want to just sort of point out here, we're on the last page in my Bible, the last page of this book. And that is not the case in a number of the Gospels. There's a lot more story to be told in lots of the other Gospels. But the reason why we're focusing so much on this is the pinnacle moment, is because, as you've already said, Clint, Jesus has spent all of this Gospel up to this point trying to get people to keep the secret, right? He keeps saying, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody. Well, the thing that happens when the Roman centurion sees this upon Jesus' death is that suddenly Jesus is no longer stopping the secret from being known. Jesus, in his dying, the secret is released. And what's really powerful is everything that we're going to talk about this gospel from this moment on is about how that secret is going to be propelled into the world. And the gospels are never written solely as historical documents. In other words, though they tell us what happened, they always have teaching as to what it should mean for us because it happened. And as it relates to Mark, what that means in this particular instance is that we too are now observers of the secret because we know Jesus Christ as the crucified one. In other words, everybody who lives on the other side of that cross, everybody who occupies the place of the centurion, we're now privy to the secret. And because we have a responsibility to disseminate that information in our own lives. And to a church who received this, especially if they were Roman, there's this sense in which there's a kind of liberating evangelism in that, to say, you are called as a believer, and this is the thing that you're called to share. And it almost reminds me of John's gospel, this idea that we're witnesses to the gospel. I mean, I think that that's under the surface of what we see happening here, because how quickly this gospel now moves to the church going out into the world.
Yeah, and let's finish up this section, just two more verses, but they do introduce another interesting theme. So verse 40, there were also women looking on from a distance, among them Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provide for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So very interesting in the Gospel of Mark that really for the rest of the story, for the rest of the gospel, women are going to take the center stage. We're going to have a brief appearance tomorrow by a man named Joseph, who is not insignificant, but for the most part, the rest of this story is going to be couched in female characters. And what's amazing about that is now that we've come to this pinnacle moment, we've had a Roman soldier and now a group of women who in Jesus' day, again, would have not been accorded as prophetic or as people you would expect to be front and center in the story. And yet, those are the people to whom the good news is proclaimed or made visible in the centurion's case. And, Mark, much less than Luke, Michael, Mark doesn't get a lot of credit for being a kind of socially sensitive kind of gospel. Luke has got a ton of caring for the poor and the least and the lost. Less of that in Mark. Mark hones the story down more towards his purpose. But this is, I think, remarkable in that, especially when we get to the endings, and we'll talk about those endings, but especially when you consider where we think this book originally ended, that we don't hear from another man in the story. We don't hear from a disciple. We don't hear, I mean, you could argue the angel, but realistically, this centurion and then this group of women, they are the first voices that experience the truth and are invited to share it. In the centurion's case, he does. In the women's case, we'll see.
Yeah, check me on this, Clint, and I don't want to talk too much pastor shop here, but historically, as the church has interpreted the Gospels, there has been a lot of ink spilled on Matthew, Luke, and John. And one of the reasons for that is, for a long time, people thought that Mark was only interesting because it seemed to serve as sort of a foundation for these other gospel writers who got Mark and then told their gospels in interesting ways to interesting people on top of it. It was sort of this idea that Mark is kind of the backbone of the gospel, and that these other gospel writers sort of used it to their purposes. And to whatever extent that was sort of the academic idea, I think it completely missed the point, because I think this gospel does have a very strong theme, and I think it does have on its own rights this kind of telling of who Jesus is, with a kind of authority and presence and persistence that is unique to Mark's telling. It's not just something that sort of is interesting because it's been reused in different ways. I think if you come to Mark as we have in this study and you let it speak for itself, I think this gospel has a lot to say. And I think there's a lot there that might surprise you. And I think the example of women here at the end is a really good point. I think there's also quite a bit more teaching and miracles, even though they lack some details. I think the way that they're structured together is unique to Mark, and I think all very helpful.
Yeah, and I don't want to drag us down, but Mark, I think historically has been thought of as the least polished of the Gospels, and maybe the church, looking for certainty and clarity, maybe lean toward those things that seemed a little more finished. I think the church in the late part of its history, the latter part here, has rediscovered the idea that messiness can be very, very interesting, and that if you look to Mark and understand where the gaps are and the question marks, and try to understand why it is that Mark does the story this way, I think we have found a depth in it that historically has always been there, and some have always seen it, but I feel like we have rediscovered that depth in the last, I don't know, last couple centuries, century and a half, maybe.
Yeah, you've already said, Clint, that the Easter aspect of this story is abbreviated, and that's maybe even an understatement. So we've got a lot to cram in the next couple of days, and it's all really, I think, interesting and valuable.
Yeah, I think we'll be back at it tomorrow, and we'll get into the transition between Good Friday and Easter, and go from there.
All right, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Hey, thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, Regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.